Welcome to the world of ancient Rome, as we explore the incredible story of its 500-year rise and fall. So, go ahead and get comfortable. Let your head sink into the pillow and feel your shoulders relax. There is nothing else for you to do right now but breathe. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Are you settling in for the night? Or perhaps just beginning your day in your own perfectly managed empire of tasks? Whatever the hour, you are so welcome here. If this space feels restful to you, a gentle tap on the subscribe button ensures we can find each other again. Now, let your mind drift back. Long before our world of buzzing screens and hurried schedules, a city was growing on 7 hills. Its people, farmers and soldiers, had little idea they were laying the foundation for a legacy that would echo through millennia. Our story begins there, not with emperors, but with the citizens of a young republic, whose collective decisions would shape everything to come. The rough leather grip of the short sword felt different in Lucius's hand than the worn wood of the plow. Both left calluses, but they were not the same. One was the callus of turning soil, of coaxing life from the earth. The other was the hard-earned mark of gripping a weapon tight that a sudden shock would not send it flying. His shoulder ached from the weight of his shield, a dull complaint that had followed him for the last 2 days. Returning from a border skirmish with a handful of Sabine raiders always left him with this specific tiredness, a weariness that settled deeper than bone. It was the exhaustion of a farmer forced to be a soldier, a role as common to the men of his city as the turning of the seasons. Ahead of him, the 7 hills of his home began to separate from the rolling landscape. It was not a grand sight of marble and towering columns. From this distance, it was a cluster of thatched roofs and wattle and daub huts clinging to the slopes, threaded together by dirt paths that turned to mud in the rain. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from 100 different hearths, a signal of evening meals being prepared. This was the place his father called home, and his grandfather before him. It was a promise, but a promise that required constant defense. Along the way, he passed the simple stone altar to Jupiter, its surface stained by weather and the wine of countless offerings. His father had been here just last week, asking for rain for their struggling barley crop, a prayer that was answered with a brief but welcome shower. The familiar rhythm of his mother's grinding stone reached him before he even saw his family's hut. It was a constant sound in their lives, the scrape of stone on stone, turning hard grain into the flour for their daily bread. She looked up as he entered, her hands white with dust, and a quiet relief softened the lines around her eyes. His father, mending a leather strap by the low fire, simply nodded. Words were not needed to express the worry that had been their companion since Lucius marched out with the other men of his age. The questions that followed were practical, not heroic. "Did we lose anyone?" his father asked, his voice low. "Just Marcus's boy, a spear wound in his side. He will recover," Lucius replied, setting his heavy shield against the wall. This conversation continued as they ate their simple meal of coarse bread and goat cheese. The talk was not of glory or empires, but of survival. His father's brow furrowed as he spoke of the Etruscans to the north, whose well-armed patrols were seen more and more frequently near the river. "Their new king is ambitious," he said, tearing a piece of bread. He looks at our lands with hungry eyes. This led to the ever-present anxiety about the harvest. Another raid from the Sabines to the east, even a small one, could mean the loss of livestock they couldn't afford to replace before winter. Their world was small, defined by the reach of a day's walk and the shadow of their neighbors' ambitions. Lucius listened, the ache in his shoulder a physical reminder of the truth in his father's words. Later, his younger sister, Elia, begged for a story. She settled beside him near the fire, her eyes wide in the flickering light. Lucius found himself telling the tale the elders so often told, the one that explained who they were. He spoke of the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned by a river, but saved by a she-wolf who nourished them. He described how they grew strong and defiant, gathering followers from the outcasts and runaways of other cities, men who had nothing and were therefore afraid of nothing. To Lucius and his family, this was not some grand or unbelievable myth. It was a story that made sense of their hard lives, a reminder that their people were founded by struggle, born from defiance, and had to fight for every furrow of land they plowed. As he spoke, he could see his sister picturing the wolf, a creature of the wild, giving life to the founders of their city. The story was a part of their identity, a root that held them fast in this often unforgiving soil. He explained how the brothers, in their pride, had argued, and how Romulus had ultimately struck down his own twin to mark the boundaries of their new home with his own authority. It was a harsh ending, but it felt true. It spoke of the necessity of strength and the sometimes brutal cost of building something that would last. The story reminded them that even brothers could turn on each other, so one must always be wary of neighbors. It wasn't about gods and magic. It was about the hard reality of power and survival. His duties for the day were not yet over. After the meal, Lucius took his spear and cloak and walked toward the edge of the settlement. The community had built a crude palisade, a wall of sharpened wooden stakes, on the most vulnerable side of their hill. It wouldn't stop a determined army, but it would slow down raiders and give the defenders time to rally. His watch began as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the landscape in shades of deep blue and gray. Other men stood at intervals along the wall, their shapes dark and silent against the horizon. The sounds of the settlement behind him slowly quieted. A crying child soothed, a dog barking once before being shushed, the last doors being barred. The cool night air began to seep through his woolen cloak, and he pulled it tighter around his shoulders. A slight breeze rustled the leaves in the nearby woods, a sound that made every sentry grip his spear a little firmer. Was that just the wind, or the sound of someone moving stealthily through the undergrowth? This was the constant question that filled the long hours of the night watch. Every shadow could be an enemy, every unexpected noise a threat. He scanned the dark fields, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the landscape, searching for anything out of place. This state of heightened awareness was as much a part of his life as planting seeds in the spring. He thought about the Etruscans his father had mentioned. They had great cities with high stone walls, skilled artisans who worked in bronze, and powerful kings who led disciplined armies. By contrast, his people were farmers, defending their homes with what little they had. He had seen the fine craftsmanship of an Etruscan helmet once, taken from a fallen warrior, and its quality was far beyond anything their own smiths could produce. The disparity made him wonder about the future. Could they truly hold this land forever? A small cluster of villages surrounded by older, wealthier, and more powerful neighbors? The elders spoke of destiny, of the strength passed down from the wolf's children. But on a cold night, that felt like a distant comfort. His mind turned from the threats outside the walls to the life within them. He pictured his sister, asleep and safe in their hut, her head filled with stories of wolves and defiant founders. He thought of the child he hoped to have one day. A deep, unsettling question surfaced in his mind, one that often came to him during these quiet, lonely hours on the wall. Would his children also have to stand watch like this? Would they know the dual calluses of the plow and the sword? He wondered if his descendants would ever know a life where the harvest was the only thing to worry about, a life without the constant, gnawing fear of a burning farm and the sound of approaching enemies in the dark. For now, there were no answers. There was only the weight of the spear in his hand, the chill on his skin, and the responsibility to see the sunrise. He adjusted his stance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other to ward off the cold that seeped up from the packed earth. The silence of the countryside was deep, broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. His world had shrunk to this small section of a wooden wall, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the night. The safety of his family, his neighbors, and his entire community depended on his vigilance and on the vigilance of the men standing silently beside him in the darkness. Around the sleeping settlement, the soft sounds of the Italian night continued their ancient, indifferent rhythm, unaware of the small city clinging to its 7 hills and the men who guarded its fragile existence. Lucius listened to the whisper of the wind, a sound that held both peace and the potential for danger, and waited for the dawn. The motion of the deck was a constant, unwelcome surprise. It lurched and rolled with a rhythm entirely unlike the solid earth Marcus had known his whole life, a feeling that kept his stomach in a tight knot. For generations, his family had tilled the soil, their feet firmly planted on Roman land. Now, his world was pitching wood and the endless gray-blue sea. He and the other men, bakers, masons, and mostly farmers like himself, gripped the ropes, their knuckles white, as they practiced lowering the great hinged bridge from its post. At its end was a heavy, cruel-looking spike, designed to slam into an enemy deck and hold it fast. The officers called it the corvus, the crow, for the way it pecked and held its prey. This clumsy contraption, they were told, was their only real advantage against the sailors from Carthage, men who were born to the sea and could dance their ships around Rome's lumbering vessels. This strange new life was an assault on all the senses. A sharp, biting smell of pine tar used to seal the hull planks was always present, a scent that clung to his tunic and his skin. The constant spray from the waves left a crust of salt on his lips, a taste he could never quite wash away. Even the food was alien. The hard biscuit and dried fish were nothing like the warm olive oil drizzled bread his wife Livia would pull from their small oven. To manage this new existence, the legionaries brought the structure of the land with them. They organized the ship into centuries and maniples, the same units they used on the battlefield, creating a small piece of the army afloat on the vast, unforgiving water. Their centurion, a man whose face was a roadmap of old scars, drilled them relentlessly, turning farmers into something resembling sailors through sheer repetition and discipline. Back in Rome, Livia felt the war not as the lurch of a ship, but as a slow, grinding pressure on her life. The price of grain in the Forum had doubled, then tripled, and the whispers among the market stalls were of shortages and uncertain shipments from the south. Every trip for food was a source of anxiety, watching the precious coins in her small purse dwindle with each purchase. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Fewer festivals were celebrated with the old abandon, and the faces of the women gathered at the public fountains were etched with worry for their husbands and sons fighting across the water in a place called Sicily. Livia often found herself walking past the great temples, hearing the murmurs of official prayers for victory, for the glory of the Republic. One morning, after staring at the nearly empty grain sack in her pantry, Livia made a difficult decision. She took out a small wooden box that held a single piece of jewelry, a heavy silver bracelet passed down from her grandmother. The metal felt cool and solid in her palm, each link worn smooth with time. It was a painful sacrifice, a piece of her family's small history. In the market, she bartered with a merchant whose eyes were shrewd but not unkind. He gave her a handful of coins, enough to buy flour and oil for a few more weeks. The lightness of her wrist on the walk home was a constant, hollow reminder of what the war was costing, not just in lives far away, but in the quiet sacrifices made in every home. That evening, she went to the small temple near her home, leaving a pinch of precious flour as an offering. Her prayer was not for Roman victory or the conquest of cities, but a simple, desperate plea for Marcus to return home safely. Miles away, at a dusty camp on the Sicilian coast, Marcus dictated a letter. He stood beside a scribe, a young, educated man from a wealthy family, feeling clumsy and slow as he searched for the words. "Tell her," Marcus began, his voice rough, "that the heat here dries the throat and the ground is rocky, not like our fields." He described the strange fruits he had seen and the sour wine the locals drank, so different from the familiar taste of home. He told her not to worry, that his training was good and his shield was strong. He did not describe the fear that sometimes crept in during the long watches of the night, nor the gnawing ache of homesickness. He finished by asking the scribe to add a final line. "Tell her I long for the taste of her bread more than anything." The scribe's stylus scratched across the wax tablet, capturing a soldier's simple longing. That longing was soon buried under a wave of terror. The alarm came as a harsh blast from a horn, followed by shouts from the lookout perched high on the mast. Carthaginian ships, sleek and fast, were bearing down on them. The Roman fleet, heavier and less nimble, turned to meet them. The air filled with the rhythmic chanting of the oarmasters, pushing the rowers below deck to their absolute limit. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he took his place near the corvus, his shield on his arm and his short sword, his gladius, feeling heavy in his hand. The enemy ship grew larger with terrifying speed, its bronze ram aimed directly at their side. He braced for the impact, a brutal, bone-jarring crash of wood and metal that threw men from their feet. The world dissolved into a harsh mix of sounds, splintering timbers, the desperate screams of men from the decks below, and the grinding roar of the corvus being released. The great spike slammed into the enemy deck, locking the two ships together in a deadly embrace. "Go!" the centurion roared, and Marcus surged forward with the others, crossing the bridge onto the Carthaginian ship. The fighting was a chaotic, close-quarters struggle. There was no room for grand tactics, only the brutal reality of shield against shield and sword against flesh. He moved on instinct, his farmer's strength serving him well. As he pushed and stabbed, his world narrowed to the man in front of him. The deck grew slick with blood, the air thick with the coppery smell of it. He survived. When the fighting subsided, Marcus stood panting, leaning on his shield, his body trembling from the surge of battle. The deck of the captured vessel was a ruin, littered with the dead and dying from both sides. He looked out at the sea, where other ships were burning, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. They had won the engagement, and the talk among the surviving men was of victory and the weakness of the Carthaginian soldiers once they were forced into a land-style battle. They cheered for Rome and for their ingenuity, for the crow that had turned the tide. But as Marcus stared at the devastation, a cold question settled in his mind. He saw the faces of the enemy dead, young men not so different from himself. He thought of the Roman farmers who now lay at the bottom of the sea, men who would never again see their fields or their families. He tried to picture the island of Sicily, this prize for which they were all fighting and dying, but he could only see a place of rock and dust that was not his home. The cost of this victory felt immense, a weight of bronze and bodies that was hard to justify. He wondered if the senators in Rome, the men in their clean togas who made speeches about glory and destiny, could truly comprehend the price being paid. Did they understand what it felt like to watch a friend fall, to hear the sound of a ship breaking apart, to feel the life drain from another man at the end of your own sword? He thought of Livia and the small farm he had left behind, a place of simple, life-giving work. This new work, the business of killing, felt corrosive, as if the salt of the sea was seeping into his very soul. The sharp scent of blood and tar lingered in his nostrils as he began the grim task of helping the wounded. He looked at his hands, calloused from both the plow and the sword, and for the first time, he felt a deep uncertainty about which tool was truly building Rome. The memory of the chaos lingered as Marcus worked, his mind grappling with the thought that every inch of this new naval empire was being bought with the lives of farmers who had never before seen the sea. Gaius crumbled the dry earth between his fingers, watching it turn to a fine powder and drift away on the afternoon breeze. The boundary stone, a simple gray rock his grandfather had placed, seemed to lean a little more each year, as if tired of its post. Beyond it, the senator's estate stretched as far as he could see, its fields a deep, healthy green, worked by gangs of men with empty eyes and scarred backs, men captured in wars that had made the senator rich. The rhythmic chant of their overseer was a constant, low hum on the edge of hearing. On his own side of the stone, the soil was pale and weary, the furrows shallow and cracked. This land had fed his family for generations, but its strength was gone, leached away by too many seasons of asking for more than it could give. This exhaustion in the soil was a deep ache in his own bones. His sons, both of them strong and willing, had left for Rome 2 seasons ago. They had told him there was no future in scratching at this tired patch of earth, not when the great estates could produce grains so cheaply with their armies of slaves. They sent back a few coins when they could, earned from hauling stones for a new temple or cleaning the filth from the city's gutters. But Gaius knew they were just as trapped as he was. He missed the sound of their arguments and the weight of their presence in the small farmhouse. Now, the only sounds were the incessant rasping of insects and the worried murmurs of his wife as she mended a tunic that was more patch than cloth. It was the hope of seeing his sons again, of putting a real tool back in their hands, that made him decide to walk the long road to the city himself. He set out before dawn, with a small sack containing a water skin, a hunk of hard bread, and a few dried figs. The journey to Rome was a pilgrimage of the desperate. On the road, he joined a slow-moving river of other men, whose faces mirrored his own, their skin weathered by the elements, their eyes holding a mixture of stubborn pride and quiet fear. They walked past the grand villas of the wealthy, their marble columns gleaming behind high walls, and saw the endless fields worked by slaves. They were all small men, owners of dwindling plots, being squeezed out by a world that had grown too large for them. They spoke little, but a shared understanding passed between them in nods and glances. They were all going to the Forum to hear the words of Tiberius Gracchus, a name whispered with a reverence usually reserved for the gods. When he finally reached the city, the sheer volume of life was overwhelming. The noise was a physical force, a constant wave of shouting merchants, rumbling carts, and the babble of countless conversations. The press of bodies made his movements slow and clumsy after a life of open fields. He navigated through the narrow streets, the smells of cooking food, stale wine, and unwashed humanity making his head spin. He followed the flow of the crowd, a current of dusty tunics and worn sandals, until he emerged into the vast open space of the Forum. Here, thousands of men like him were gathered, their faces turned toward the rostra, the speaker's platform. For the first time since his sons had left, Gaius felt he was not alone. Standing there, shoulder to shoulder with so many others, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout in his chest. From within the cool, shaded interior of her covered chair, carried smoothly on the shoulders of 4 strong servants, the noblewoman Cornelia observed the scene with a troubled mind. The sheer size of the crowd was unsettling, a sea of rough, common men whose faces were etched with hardship. Through the swaying curtains, she could feel the energy of the gathering, a raw, volatile thing that worried her. Her son-in-law, a respected senator, had spoken at length about the danger this Tiberius Gracchus posed. He called him a revolutionary, a man who would tear down the foundations of the Republic to satisfy the whims of a mob. He accused Gracchus of stirring up envy and resentment, promising what could not be delivered, all for the sake of his own ambition. Cornelia, however, found herself torn. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal, and the blood of heroes ran in her veins. She believed in the strength and order of Rome, in the traditions that had guided it for centuries. Yet she could not entirely dismiss the sight before her. The faces in the crowd were not those of lazy men seeking handouts. They were the faces of the citizen soldiers who had won the empire's wars, now left with nothing. She wondered if her son-in-law and his peers, comfortable in their grand houses, could truly understand the desperation that drove these men to abandon their farms and flock to the city. She adjusted the fine silk of her stola, a garment worn by respectable married women, and felt a pang of uncertainty. Was Gracchus a danger to the Republic, or was he trying to save it from the greed of its most powerful man? That evening, the debate continued in the softly lit dining room of her son-in-law's villa. Guests reclined on couches, sipping wine from delicate Greek cups, as servants moved silently, offering plates of roasted fowl, spiced fish, and sweet cakes. The talk was of nothing but Gracchus. "He undermines the authority of the Senate," one man declared, his voice rising with indignation. "He speaks directly to the people, as if their passions and not our laws should govern Rome. It is a path to tyranny." Another guest, a younger senator known for his more moderate views, countered gently. "But can we deny that there is a sickness in our state? The small farms are disappearing. Our legions are harder to fill because fewer men own land. Perhaps Tiberius is merely pointing out a wound we have ignored for too long." The argument grew more heated. Voices were raised, and gestures became sharp. Her son-in-law insisted that the public lands Gracchus wanted to reclaim were legally held, developed over generations by their families. To take them back now was not reform, it was theft. He spoke of the ungrateful masses, always demanding more, and the need for a firm hand to maintain order. Cornelia listened, tasting the rich, sweet wine on her tongue while the bitter words filled the room. The men spoke of laws, property, and power. They spoke of the mob and the state. But she thought of the faces she had seen in the forum, and it seemed to her that no one at this table was speaking about the people themselves. The entire conversation felt distant from the hard, cracked earth that was at the center of it all. Meanwhile, Gaius sat with a group of other farmers near a public fountain, sharing a loaf of coarse bread. The excitement from the forum still buzzed in his veins. Tiberius Gracchus had spoken with a fire that warmed them all. He had not spoken of complex laws or Senate procedure. He had spoken of justice. He talked of the men who fought and died for Rome in foreign lands, only to return home and find themselves dispossessed, strangers in their own country. He promised to enforce the old laws, forgotten by the rich, that limited how much public land one man could hold. He promised to give the surplus back to the citizens, to give them a chance to rebuild their lives and raise their sons as proud Roman farmers, not as beggars in the city. The words had washed over Gaius like a clean, cool rain after a long drought. He looked at the men around him, saw the hope in their eyes, and felt a bond stronger than any he had known outside his own family. They were no longer just a collection of struggling individuals, they were a cause. One man, older and more cynical, spat on the ground. "Words are wind," he grumbled. "The senators will never allow it. They own the land. They own the law. But another man clapped Gaius on the shoulder. This time it is different, he insisted. There are too many of us. Our voices together are a roar they cannot ignore. Gaius chose to believe the second man. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where his farm was secure, where his sons might return home. The days that followed were a blur of hope and tension. The city was divided. In the markets and taverns, arguments broke out constantly. Crude drawings appeared on walls overnight, some depicting Gracchus as a hero crowned with a laurel wreath, others showing him as a serpent strangling the Republic. The wealthy moved through the streets in larger groups, with armed bodyguards clearing their path. The air itself seemed charged with conflict, and every rumor, whether of a senatorial plot or a popular uprising, spread through the crowded apartment blocks like a fever. Gaius remained in the city, sleeping on the floor of a distant cousin's cramped room, not wanting to leave until the law was passed and his future secured. He spent his days in the forum, listening to the speeches and adding his voice to the chorus of support. Then came the news. It did not arrive as an official proclamation, but as a terrified shout that cut through the noise of the city. A man ran from the direction of the Capitoline Hill, his face pale, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. He spoke of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and broken pieces of furniture, of a sudden, brutal attack. He spoke of Tiberius Gracchus, the tribune of the people, cornered and beaten, his body thrown into the Tiber River along with hundreds of his supporters. The word murdered hung in the air, a final, impossible sound that silenced the entire forum. For Gaius, the world seemed to stop. The vibrant energy that had filled the city just moments before vanished, replaced by a stunned, horrifying silence. The men around him, who had been full of defiant hope, now looked lost and afraid. The seed of hope that had sprouted in his chest withered and turned to cold ash. He saw the wealthy men in their fine togas gathering in the distance, their faces grim but triumphant. There had been no debate, no vote, no law. There had only been violence. The power of the state had been used not to uphold justice, but to crush it. Slowly, his legs feeling heavy as stone, Gaius turned away from the forum and began the long walk back to his withered farm. The sounds of the city faded behind him, but the silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside. It was a dead, empty silence filled with a terrible new question. He had always believed he was a citizen of a great republic, a place of laws and shared duty. But as he walked, with the dust of the road coating his worn sandals, he wondered if the republic he had served his entire life truly belonged to all its sons, or if it was merely the private property of the powerful few, to be protected with clubs and stones. In that quiet, desolate moment, he could almost forget the simple desire for a good harvest, overshadowed now by the immense weight of a broken promise. The rain had been falling for hours, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the landscape into a blur of gray and green. For the centurion Quintus, the water felt as if it had seeped through his thick woolen cloak and into his very bones. He stood with his men on the northern bank of a small, unremarkable river, its muddy water swirling quickly past. This was the Rubicon. The name meant little to him, just another landmark in a long march. But the silence of the thousands of soldiers around him gave the place a strange weight. Every eye was fixed on the figure of their general, Gaius Julius Caesar, who sat on his horse looking south toward Italy, toward Rome. Quintus shifted his weight, the leather straps of his armor groaning softly. He and the men of the 13th Legion had followed Caesar for nearly a decade through the damp, shadow-filled forests of Gaul. They had built bridges over rivers wider than this and faced tribesmen whose painted faces were meant to inspire terror. Through it all, Caesar had been with them. Quintus could still recall a bitter winter when supplies were low, and the general himself had walked the lines, eating the same coarse grain as his legionaries and calling men by their names. He knew Quintus's village, had asked after his younger brother. That was a bond stronger than any decree from a distant city. The men in their fine togas in the Senate were just names on a scroll. Caesar was the man who led them, bled with them, and promised them a future. A horn blast cut through the quiet murmur of the river. Caesar spurred his horse forward into the shallow water, raising a hand. A cheer erupted from 10,000 throats, a single powerful roar that seemed to push the rain away. The sound was not one of rebellion, but of release. For Quintus, the decision was simple. He was a soldier, and he followed his general. As his sandals sank into the cold, silty riverbed, he felt not a sense of treason, but of purpose. The years of fighting for Rome in foreign lands were over. Now they were marching to claim their place within it. The bickering and the politics were for others to worry about. His duty was to the man on the horse ahead, the man who had never once failed them. Meanwhile, in Rome, the news arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a creeping chill. The senator Marcus Tullius Cicero felt it first as a series of uneasy whispers in the corridors of power. He pulled his toga tighter around his shoulders, a gesture that did little to ward off the cold dread settling in his gut. He walked through the great hall of the Curia, the Senate House, a place he revered as the heart of the Republic. Hundreds of his peers were gathered, their white robes a sea of agitated movement. Yet there was no unity here, only the harsh mix of dozens of separate, frantic arguments. Voices rose and fell, some demanding that Caesar be declared an enemy of the state, others pleading for negotiation and compromise. It was the sound of a ship's crew arguing about how to steer while the rocks were already scraping against the hull. Cicero paused, resting a hand on a cool marble column. For centuries, this chamber had been governed by law, by debate, by the careful and deliberate process of oration and voting. He had built his life on the power of words to shape the state, on the belief that reason and tradition were the foundations of their world. He loved the Republic, not for its power, but for its structure, a system designed to prevent any one man from growing too strong. It was a delicate balance, passed down from the ancestors who had driven out the last king, and he felt a profound sickness to see it threatened, not by a foreign army, but by one of their own sons, a Roman general at the head of a Roman legion. From the steps of the Curia, he could see into the forum below. The crowds there were different. He saw the way their faces lit up at the mention of Caesar's name. They did not speak of laws or traditions. They spoke of the grain Caesar had promised, the land he would give to his veterans, and the glory his victories had brought to Rome. Cicero understood their loyalty. What did the abstract principles of the Republic matter to a man whose children were hungry? The failure of men like the Gracchi brothers decades before had left a wound in the heart of Rome, a division between the powerful and the poor that Caesar was now exploiting with masterful skill. The Senate had offered laws. Caesar was offering bread and a leader to believe in.
Later, in a quiet portico, Cicero spoke with a small group of fellow senators. One, old Fabius, wrung his hands. "We must send emissaries," he urged, his voice thin with anxiety. "We can grant him his triumph, perhaps another consulship. He is a Roman, after all. A compromise can be found." In stark contrast, the fiery Lentulus slammed his fist into his palm. "Compromise? The man has committed treason. We must arm our legions and crush him before he reaches the city. We must show that the law is absolute." Cicero listened, feeling himself pulled in two directions. His mind agreed with Lentulus. The law had been broken, but his heart knew that the legions loyal to the Senate were scattered and unprepared. A call to arms might be a noble gesture, but it would also be the beginning of a catastrophic civil war, pitting Roman against Roman. The choice, he realized with a sinking heart, was no longer his to make. It was no longer a matter for debate in the hallowed halls of the Curia. The arguments of lawyers and the speeches of orators were now just echoes in a room where power had already left. The future of the Republic would not be decided by a vote, but by the tramping feet of disciplined legions on the long stone roads leading to the city. It would be settled by the sharp edge of the gladius, the short sword that had carved out an empire and was now being turned inward to strike at its own heart. The system he cherished had failed to contain the ambition of one man and the devotion of his soldiers. Far to the north, Quintus felt none of this turmoil. He simply marched. The rain had finally stopped, and his legion moved with the steady, relentless rhythm of a single organism. The man joked quietly, their anxieties about crossing the river now replaced by a familiar sense of determination. They were on the move, following their commander, and that was all that mattered. They did not see themselves as a rebel army. They saw themselves as the true representatives of Roman strength, coming home to set things right. The endless political squabbles in the capital had weakened the state, and it was their duty, as they saw it, to restore order under the one man they trusted to lead. Back in Rome, a messenger, his face pale and his breathing ragged, delivered the official confirmation. Caesar's legions were advancing swiftly. City after city was opening its gates to him without a fight. Standing in his study, surrounded by scrolls containing the wisdom of ages and the laws of the Republic, Cicero felt a profound sense of helplessness. All his learning, all his skill with words, all his devotion to the state. It all felt like a fragile dam of parchment standing in the path of a flood. He was caught between a system he loved that was proving too weak to survive, and a charismatic man whose rise represented the very tyranny his ancestors had fought to abolish. The conflict was no longer about abstract ideals of governance or the interpretation of ancient laws. It had become a raw contest of power, a struggle for the soul of Rome itself. The bonds of loyalty that held the Republic together had frayed and snapped, replaced by a new and more powerful allegiance. The idea of the state, once the supreme authority, had now been overshadowed by the loyalty felt for a single powerful man. And that devotion had woven itself so deeply into the hearts of his soldiers that it threatened to unravel the entire world they were sworn to protect. This section explores the irrevocable decision of Julius Caesar to cross the Rubicon, contrasting the unwavering personal loyalty of his centurion Quintus with the principled but powerless alarm of the senator Cicero, thereby showing the critical shift from civic duty to allegiance to a single charismatic leader. The end state. The Republic's legal and political authority has effectively collapsed, as Caesar's legions march on Rome unopposed, forcing senators like Cicero to recognize that the coming conflict will be a civil war, decided by military strength, not political debate. In the quiet of his study, the only sound was the soft unrolling of a brittle papyrus scroll. Marcus Junius Brutus traced the faded lines of a letter written by an ancestor, a man who helped drive the last king from Rome centuries ago. The weight of that name, Brutus, pressed down on him, a constant reminder of a legacy built on the rejection of tyrants. He had seen the new coins bearing Caesar's face, not as a magistrate of the Republic, but as a permanent fixture. He had watched as the Senate voted him honors once reserved only for the gods, a position that blurred the line between leader and deity. Each new tribute felt like another spadeful of earth being thrown onto the Republic's grave. This growing certainty did little to calm the sickness that churned in his stomach. He remembered Caesar as a commander, a mentor, even a friend. He could still picture the man's easy smile and hear his confident laugh. To strike him down felt like a betrayal not just of a man, but of a personal history they shared. His fellow conspirators met in the shadowed corners of villas, their plans spoken in urgent whispers that seemed a world away from the noisy confidence of Caesar's supporters in the Forum. They spoke of duty, of liberty, of saving the state, and Brutus agreed with every word. Yet he wrestled with the cold truth that to save the idea of Rome, he would have to destroy a great Roman. The meetings were always tense, the air in the rooms feeling thin and hard to draw into the lungs. One evening, Cassius, his face sharp with conviction, argued that Caesar's ambition was a disease that required a surgeon's knife, not a politician's negotiation. Brutus looked at the faces around him. Senators, praetors, men of esteemed families, all gambling their lives on the belief that one man's death could rewind time and restore the old ways. He found himself torn between the world as it was under Caesar's firm and popular control, and the world as it should be, governed by law and shared power. The choice left a bitter taste in his mouth, a flavor of cold iron and regret. On the morning of the Ides of March, a freedman named Sosigenus was carefully cataloging newly arrived tax records from Hispania. He worked in the tabularium, the great public records office whose stone arches overlooked the heart of Rome. The faint scent of cedar oil, used to preserve the countless scrolls, was a familiar comfort. Below him, the forum was a river of activity, its usual mix of merchants haggling, lawyers orating, and citizens simply meeting to discuss the day's news. Sosigenus took pride in his work. Here, in these meticulously organized documents, was the true foundation of the Republic, its laws, its treaties, its census figures. It was a testament to order, a story of centuries written in ink and papyrus. It was this sense of predictable rhythm that made the first hint of disruption so jarring. Sosigenus first heard a confused shouting, a sound that came not from the forum, but from the direction of the theater of Pompeii, where the Senate was meeting that day. He paused, his hand hovering over a scroll. The shouting grew louder, more panicked. Then, through the archway, he saw them. A small group of senators, their white togas flapping as they ran into the open, their faces pale with shock. They were not walking with dignity. They were fleeing, stumbling over the uneven stones as if pursued by some unseen terror. More followed, their panicked flight sending ripples of alarm through the crowds in the forum. Soon, the news spread, not as an official decree, but as a frantic whisper passed from person to person, a rumor that ignited like a spark in dry grass. "Caesar is dead," a courier gasped to a clerk near the tabularian's entrance. "Stabbed in the curia." The words seemed impossible, a fragment from a poorly written play. Sosigenus and the other archivists gathered at the windows, watching as the rumor became a torrent. The news washed over the forum, but it did not bring the cheers of liberation that the killers might have expected. Instead, an unnerving silence began to fall over the city, a quiet more frightening than any shout.
The initial shock gave way to a pervasive sense of fear. Vendors who had been loudly hawking their wares just moments before began to hastily pack their goods, their movements quick and furtive. Families grabbed their children's hands and hurried away from the public square, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows of the alleyways. The vibrant heart of Rome was emptying, the river of people draining away until only a few bewildered clusters remained. From his high vantage point, Sosigenes watched as heavy wooden shutters were slammed shut and iron bolts scraped across doors. The people were not celebrating the return of the Republic. They were locking themselves away, bracing for what would come next. Brutus and his fellow conspirators emerged from the theater of Pompeii, their daggers still stained,
calling out that the tyrant was dead. They had expected the people to rush forward, to hail them as saviors, just as their ancestors had hailed the first Brutus. But the streets they entered were eerily quiet. The faces they saw in the windows were not filled with gratitude, but with confusion and dread. They had performed their terrible, necessary act, but in the vacuum that followed, there was no immediate rush to embrace the liberty they offered. They had killed a man, but the system of laws and traditions they sought to protect seemed to have vanished with him, leaving only a cold and uncertain void. This strange new quiet was a profound shock. The conspirators had imagined a city erupting in celebration, a spontaneous festival for the rebirth of freedom. Instead, they found themselves standing alone in the center of a city, holding its breath. The popular support they had assumed would materialize simply did not appear. It became terrifyingly clear that Caesar's power had not just been in his legions or his titles. It had been rooted in the loyalty of the common people, who now saw his death not as a noble act, but as the beginning of another round of chaos and civil war. The silence of the city was their answer, and it was deafening. Back in the tabularium, Sosigenes stood motionless, the Spanish tax scroll forgotten in his hand. He looked around at the towering walls of shelves, each alcove filled with the accumulated wisdom and governance of centuries. There were scrolls detailing the laws of land ownership, the minutes of Senate meetings from the time of the Gracchi, and treaties signed with kingdoms he could barely place on a map. Everything that made Rome, Rome was contained in this building. He felt the immense weight of that history, a careful construction of rules and agreements designed to prevent the city from falling into the hands of one ambitious man. He walked over to a shelf and pulled out a heavy scroll, its wooden handles smooth from generations of use. It was one of the 12 tables, the foundational laws of the Republic, painstakingly copied from the original bronze tablets. He read a line about the sanctity of a citizen's rights, a principle that had guided the city for nearly 500 years. Now, with Caesar dead and the city frozen in fear, he wondered if any of these words still held power. The city was leaderless, caught between a group of assassins claiming to be liberators and the dead man's allies, who would surely seek revenge. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the empty forum. The work in the tabularium had stopped. No one had the focus to continue their duties. Each sound from the street below, a distant shout, a running footstep, made them all startle. Sosigenes felt a deep and unsettling premonition that the act of killing one man to save the Republic had, in fact, ensured its final destruction. The scrolls around him no longer felt like the bedrock of their world, but like relics of a time that had just ended. The real power now lay not in these laws, but with the legions loyal to Caesar's memory. Later, as he walked home through the strangely deserted streets, the city felt alien. The familiar sounds of life, the laughter from a tavern, the call of a water cellar, the rumble of cartwheels were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. he saw armed guards, loyal to Caesar's faction, beginning to appear on the street corners, their faces grim and watchful. Sosigenes reached his small apartment in a crowded insula and slid the heavy wooden bar across his door. As he prepared for a restless night, the profound silence from the city outside, where once there had been the constant hum of life, offered no comfort at all. The groan of the thick hemp ropes was a familiar song to Camilla, a constant strain against the weight of the world. She stood beside her father, her hand resting on a half-finished pillar, its marble cool and smooth against her palm. High above, suspended from the arm of a massive wooden crane, powered by a dozen men walking inside a great wheel, a block of pure white stone turned slowly. The men's rhythmic grunts were the heartbeat of the construction site. She traced the faint gray veins in the pillar, thinking of the long journey this stone had taken from the quarries in Greece, a journey now safe enough for such perfect pieces to arrive without flaw. Her father pointed upwards, his finger thick with stone dust. "See how it settles? Perfect balance. The gods favor a steady hand, but the emperor's new piece favors a full purse to pay for it." This new piece was remaking the city before her eyes. Camilla remembered the Rome of her childhood, a place of narrow streets and crumbling brick buildings, the air often carrying the scent of decay from the marshy grounds near the river. Now, that memory was being buried under new foundations. Her father often spoke of how the Emperor Augustus had found a city of brick and was leaving it a city of marble. For Camilla, this transformation was not a grand political statement, but the daily reality of shouting foremen, the sharp tang of wet lime in her throat, and the gritty feel of dust on her skin. She watched the workers below, preparing a batch of the new building mixture, a secret of lime, water, and a dark, gritty volcanic ash brought from the south. This material, her father explained, was stronger than stone alone and could be shaped into curves and arches that would have been impossible for his grandfather to even imagine. This new piece was remaking the city before her eyes. Camilla remembered the Rome of her childhood, a place of narrow streets and crumbling brick buildings, the air often carrying the scent of decay from the marshy grounds near the river. Now, that memory was being buried under new foundations. Her father often spoke of how the Emperor Augustus had found a city of brick and was leaving it a city of marble. For Camilla, this transformation was not a grand political statement, but the daily reality of shouting foremen, the sharp tang of wet lime in her throat, and the gritty feel of dust on her skin. She watched the workers below, preparing a batch of the new building mixture, a secret of lime, water, and a dark, gritty volcanic ash brought from the south. This material, her father explained, was stronger than stone alone and could be shaped into curves and arches that would have been impossible for his grandfather to even imagine.
That very volcanic ash, scooped from the earth near the Bay of Naples, traveled on the same sea lanes that brought other, more exotic goods to the capital. Far from the noise of construction, a merchant from Alexandria named Aulus watched his crew guide his ship, the Isis's Gift, into the bustling port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. The journey from Egypt had been uneventful, a fact he no longer took for granted. He remembered his own father's stories of pirate fleets that once ruled these waters, making every voyage a gamble. Now, the seas were swept clean by Roman warships, their triangular sails a common and reassuring sight. Aulus felt the solid bump as his ship met the dock, and the familiar, organized chaos of the port enveloped him. Dock workers shouted in a dozen languages, but the commands of the harbor master, a Roman official with a stylus and wax tablet, brought order to it all. As his cargo was unloaded, the sense of his homeland mingled with the salt of the Italian coast. Jars of rich, dark Greek wine, sacks of Egyptian grain that would feed the city's countless citizens, and tightly wrapped bales of silk that had traveled 1,000 miles over land before even reaching his ship. Each item represented a link in a vast chain of commerce, now protected by a single power. Once the goods were tallied and the taxes paid, Aulus oversaw their loading onto heavy wagons. He would accompany them to the city himself, not out of fear for their safety, but to ensure the best prices. The road ahead, the Via Ostiensis, was a testament to this new era of security. It was not a muddy track, but a marvel of engineering, paved with flat, tightly fitted stones that promised a smooth, swift journey. The rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels on the stone was the sound of reliability, a sound that meant business could be done without endless delay or danger.
Following this path, Aulus entered Rome through the southern gate and was immediately struck by the scale of the changes. The air was clearer, for one. He felt a refreshing coolness on his cheeks, a sensation he traced to the countless public fountains bubbling with clean water. He looked up and saw the source, the massive raised stone channels of a new aqueduct, one of the great arteries that fed the city. These structures, marching across the countryside on their powerful arches, were a symbol of Roman might more impressive to him than any legion. They brought life and health, washing the streets clean and filling the grand public baths where men from all corners of the world could conduct business. The water itself tasted clean and cold, a simple luxury that spoke volumes about the resources and ingenuity at the city's command. This very water was a subject of constant discussion for Camilla and her father. Their current project was a new public bath, and the engineering required was immense. Her father taught her how to read the blueprints, long scrolls of papyrus, where every pipe and drain was meticulously planned. The water flows by gravity alone, he would explain, his finger tracing a line from the distant hills to the city. If the slope is off by the width of a finger over 100 paces, the whole system fails. She learned about the lead pipes, the bronze fittings, and the different chambers for hot, warm, and cold pools. It was a complex dance of materials and precise measurements, a skill that felt as vital to the empire's health as any general strategy. She saw how the new concrete allowed them to build vast vaulted ceilings over the bathing halls, creating cavernous spaces that could hold hundreds of people, rich and poor alike. In one of these newly completed baths, Aulus met with a Roman senator to finalize the sale of his silk. He relaxed in the warm water of the tepidarium, the large, moderately heated pool, letting the day's travel fatigue soak away. Around him, the sounds of the city were muted,
replaced by the gentle splashing of water and the low hum of conversations. Men of all ranks mingled here, their differences in status temporarily washed away. He saw a muscular man with the scars of a soldier speaking with a pale, slender man who was clearly a scribe. This mixing was something he rarely saw elsewhere. The senator, a man named Lucius was impressed by the quality of the silk, its smooth texture, a novelty that was becoming highly prized among the wealthy women of Rome. Their negotiation was polite and direct, a world away from the endless haggling of the Alexandrian markets. For Aulus, this sense of order was both admirable and, at times, a little strange. His own city of Alexandria was a chaotic jumble of ancient knowledge and vibrant street life, a place of thinkers and dreamers. Rome, by contrast, felt like a city of builders and administrators. It borrowed its art from the Greeks, its gods from everywhere, and its luxuries from the East, but it organized it all with a uniquely Roman practicality. He wondered if this immense, well-ordered machine could ever produce a great philosopher like Plato or a mathematician like Euclid. Or perhaps, he considered, the building of 1,000 miles of road and 100 aqueducts was its own form of philosophy, one written in stone and mortar rather than on scrolls. It was a philosophy of permanence, of a world put right and held in place by sheer force of will. Camilla felt that same force of will every day. She saw it in the calloused hands of the masons, in the precise calculations of the engineers, and in the sheer ambition of the emperor's plans. Her world was one of tangible things, of weight and measure, of the way a well-made arch could support a mountain of stone above it. She learned to recognize the different types of marble by their color and origin, and she began to understand the subtle art of combining different materials for both strength and beauty. One afternoon, her father allowed her to help mix a small batch of mortar for a mosaic floor. The work was hard, her arms aching from stirring the heavy mixture. But as she spread it smoothly, she felt a profound connection to the building rising around her. She was not just watching the city change, she was a part of its creation. This new Rome was a city of integrated cultures, a reality Iulus experienced every time he walked through the markets. He could buy Spanish olive oil, Gallic wool, and German amber, all alongside spices from India and his own Egyptian papyrus. He heard Latin spoken with every accent imaginable. While some older Romans grumbled about foreign influences, Iulus saw it as the empire's greatest strength. The peace that allowed him to trade safely was the same peace that allowed ideas and customs to travel along with the goods. He ate a dinner of Parthian chicken seasoned with spices he himself had imported, and drank wine from a vineyard in Gaul, feeling himself a true citizen of the world that Rome was building. He sometimes worried about the fragility of it all. This peace, this pax romana, as the poets were beginning to call it, was held in place by the legions on distant frontiers and the will of one man in the palace. He had seen the scars of the civil wars on the older buildings, reminders of a time not so long ago when Roman armies fought each other in the streets. Could this monumental effort of construction and administration truly erase that memory? Could stone and water and safe roads build a foundation so strong that it could never be broken again? It was a question that lingered in his mind as he looked at the new Forum of Augustus, a grand plaza of gleaming white marble and towering statues meant to proclaim a golden age. Camilla had no time for such grand questions. Her concerns were more immediate, ensuring a wall was perfectly vertical, that a new batch of concrete had the right consistency, that the drainage system for the bathhouse was properly angled. Yet, as she stood on the scaffolding one evening, looking out over the rooftops as the workers headed home, she felt a quiet sense of pride. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the new temples and basilicas, their marble surfaces reflecting the light in a way the old brick never had. The sounds of construction had faded, replaced by the murmur of a city at peace, the laughter from a nearby tavern, the call of a mother to her children. The day's work left a fine layer of white dust on her skin and a deep ache in her muscles, but the new roan of stone and marble continued its steady rise from the earth. The day for young Helena began not with light, but with sound. From the narrow window of their single room, perched high in the sprawling apartment block, the city of Rome announced its waking. First came the low rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on the stone-paved street far below, a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards. This was the signal that the ban on carts had been lifted for the morning, and the great work of feeding 1 million souls was underway. Then the vendors began their cries, each a distinct and familiar song, advertising everything from fresh bread to cheap wine. Helena shared the cramped space with her parents and 2 younger brothers, a world defined by the rough plaster of the walls and the constant presence of others. Each breath she took seemed to have been breathed by someone else first, making the simple act of living feel crowded.
Her first task was to fetch water. Taking the heavy clay jug, she squeezed past her mother, who was already kneading dough for their morning meal. The journey down the 5 flights of rickety wooden stairs was a daily adventure through a hive of humanity. Doors opened onto the landing, releasing the smells of cooking garlic, sleeping bodies, and damp laundry. On the 3rd floor, a weaver's loom clacked rhythmically, and on the 2nd, a baby cried without pause. By the time she reached the street, the sheer number of people moving through the narrow lane was like a river. She had to weave and dodge through shoppers, messengers, and loiterers, all jostling for space between the towering soot-stained walls of the multi-story buildings, the apartment complexes known simply as insulae, or islands. The public fountain was a social hub, where neighbors exchanged gossip and complaints, the cool splash of water a brief relief from the city's persistent closeness. Later, while her brothers played with knucklebones in the sliver of shade cast by their building, Helena watched the city live its life. From her high vantage point, the streets were canyons of activity. She saw porters carrying heavy sacks toward the markets, their muscles straining. Wealthy men and women were carried through the crowds in covered chairs,
their faces hidden from view, seeming to float above the dirt and noise. Every rooftop, every window, every alleyway teemed with life. It was a city built on top of itself, a dense and precarious collection of wood, brick, and tile, where a person was never truly alone. Helena sometimes wondered what it would be like to stand in an open field, to see nothing but grass and sky. But the thought was so foreign, it felt like a dream. Her world was this vertical maze, a place of constant sound and motion.
As dusk settled, another kind of life began to stir. The daytime clamor faded, replaced by the sounds of evening meals and the softer notes of music from open doorways. For a man named Felix, this was the beginning of his workday. He buckled on his leather tunic, picked up his axe and coiled rope, and joined the other men of his cohort. They were members of the Vigile Urbani, the city's watchmen, tasked with the two duties that never slept: catching thieves and fighting fires. The Emperor Augustus had created their force generations ago, and their presence was a fixture of the Roman night. Felix knew the twisting alleys of his district better than he knew the lines on his own hands. He understood their dangers, the dark corners where a man could be robbed, and the even greater threat that lurked in the very structure of the city itself. His patrol moved quietly through the labyrinthine streets. The lower levels of the insulae were often stone, but the upper floors, where the poorest citizens like Helena lived, were almost entirely timber and wickerwork. Cooking braziers glowed in countless unglazed windows, each one a tiny, necessary spark of danger. Felix and his men carried long poles with hooks for pulling down burning materials, and heavy blankets soaked in vinegar to smother smaller flames. Their main tool, however, was the axe, used not to fight a fire directly, but to demolish buildings in its path, creating a gap the flames could not cross. It was a brutal, destructive method of salvation. He often thought that his job was not to save a home, but to sacrifice a few homes in order to save a neighborhood. The night was warm, and the air carried the familiar sense of wood smoke from thousands of cooking fires, mingled with the smell of baked bread and spilled wine from the taverns they passed. In one street, a group of men argued loudly over a game of dice, their laughter echoing off the high walls. In another, a lone flute player sent a sad melody out into the darkness. It was a typical night. Felix felt the familiar rhythm of the patrol, the steady tramp of sandals on stone, the shared watchfulness of his comrades. They were a brotherhood bound by this nightly duty, a thin line of order against the city's inherent chaos. They were responsible for the safety of people they would never meet, souls sleeping in the flimsy wooden rooms stacked high above their heads.
It was near the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium, that the first hint of trouble came to him. The scent on the breeze was wrong. It was not the gentle, earthy smell of a hearth fire. This was sharp, oily, and angry. It carried a chemical bitterness that made his throat tighten. He exchanged a look with his decurion, the leader of their squad. No words were needed. They quickened their pace, their sandals slapping against the pavement. A faint orange glow pulsed against the clouds, a false dawn in the wrong part of the sky. Then they heard it. Not the casual shout of a drunkard, but a high, thin scream of pure terror, followed by another, and then a chorus. The cry went up, passed from street to street, echoing through the canyons of the city. Ignis! Ignis! Fire! When they rounded the corner, the scene was worse than anything Felix could have imagined. It was not one building, but a whole row of shops and warehouses. The flames did not climb, they exploded. An oil merchant's storeroom had gone up, and the fire, fed by the fuel, was moving with a hungry intelligence. It roared with a voice like a living monster, a deep, consuming sound that drowned out the screams of the people fleeing. Sparks, carried by the wind, swirled like angry insects, landing on the dry wooden balconies and thatched roofs of the nearby insulae. Before Felix's eyes, a new fire would erupt, 100 feet from the last, as if the blaze were leaping through the air. The heat struck him like a physical blow, forcing him to shield his face. He and his men went to work, their training taking over. They shouted at people to evacuate, their voices barely audible over the inferno's roar. They formed a bucket brigade from a nearby cistern, but the water seemed to vanish into steam before it even touched the flames. It was like trying to spit on a volcano. Felix swung his axe, the blade biting deep into the wall of a tavern that stood in the fire's path. Other vigils joined him, their axes rising and falling in a desperate rhythm. They were trying to create a fire break, to starve the beast, but it was already too late. The fire was moving faster than they could chop, leaping over their heads, consuming whole city blocks in the time it took to demolish a single building. They were no longer fighting a fire, they were simply running from it.
For Helena, the disaster began with her father bursting into the room, his face pale in the flickering orange light that now filled their window. The roar was a constant, terrifying presence, and the floor beneath their feet was growing warm. There was no time to think, no time to gather their few possessions. Her mother grabbed the youngest boy, her father the other, and Helena snatched the small wooden doll she kept by her bed. The stairwell was a nightmare of smoke and panic. The air was difficult to breathe, each gasp bringing a searing pain to her lungs. People pushed and shoved, their faces slick with sweat and terror. Someone fell, and the crowd surged over them without stopping. It was a desperate, primal flight, driven by the heat that chased them from behind. When they finally burst out into the street, the world had become an oven. The sky was not black, but a churning, malevolent orange. Buildings she had known her entire life were now just silhouettes engulfed in flame. The fire moved with a terrifying speed, consuming the dense warren of streets and apartments as if they were nothing more than kindling. The crowd became a single organism, a river of humanity flowing away from the destruction, their faces illuminated by the catastrophe they were escaping. Helena held tight to her mother's hand, her small doll clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a horror that had no name. She saw neighbors she recognized, their faces masks of disbelief. In that moment, they were not weavers or bakers or clerks. They were simply survivors, stripped of everything but the instinct to run. They fled with thousands of others, a great tide of displaced people moving toward the only safe places they could think of, the open grounds of public parks and the sprawling gardens on the city's hills.
There, under a sky stained with smoke, they stopped. The great city, the heart of the world, was burning behind them. Helena and her family found a spot on the grass, huddling together for warmth as a cool breeze began to blow, a breeze that only fanned the flames they had escaped. Around them, families wept for lost homes and missing relatives. Strangers shared the little food and water they had managed to save. A woman gave Helena's mother a piece of bread, and her mother broke it into pieces for the children.
In the days that followed, the fire raged on, and the camps of the homeless grew. The bonds of neighborhood, once defined by a shared street or a common fountain, were reforged in this shared experience of loss. People who had been strangers now shared stories, offered comfort, and looked after one another's children. It was in these huddled groups that the whispers began. Some said the fire was an accident, a tragic consequence of the city's own density. Others murmured that the gods were angry. But a more sinister rumor took hold, passed from one survivor to another in hushed tones. They said that the Emperor Nero himself had started it, that he had been seen watching the blaze from his palace, singing a song about the fall of Troy. For Helena, the rumors were just noise, distant and unimportant. The emperor was an abstract figure, as remote as the gods. What was real was the cold ground beneath her blanket, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, and the sight of her father's shoulders slumped in despair. Her home was gone, her street was gone, the world she knew had been turned to ash. Everything that had been certain was now gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling quiet in the heart of the city's great noise. In the quiet of the refugee camp, under a sky still hazy with smoke, Helena found a strange solace, not in hope, but in the shared presence of her family and the quiet solidarity of the dispossessed. A persistent drizzle settled over the land, turning the world a uniform gray. Serdic felt the dampness seep through the thick wool of his cloak, a familiar chill that reached his bones. His hands, calloused from both the spear and the building trowel, rested on the cold, wet stone of the great wall. To the south lay the ordered world of the forts, the straight roads, and the tile-roofed villas of the empire he served. To the north, the misty hills rolled away into an untamed wilderness, the land of his ancestors, the land of the painted tribes who refused to bow. He was born in a village not 20 miles from this spot, yet now he wore Roman armor, spoke a clumsy version of their Latin, and carried their eagle standard. The wall was not just stone and turf, it was a line drawn through his own heart. This very line was the source of endless worry for Governor Flavius, miles to the south in his heated villa in Eboracum, the settlement known today as York. He studied a large map spread across a wooden table, its surface covered in names that sounded foreign on his Roman tongue. Reports arrived daily, carried by riders who braved the long, often dangerous roads. These reports spoke of minor skirmishes, stolen cattle, and the ever-present threat of a larger raid from the northern Pictish tribes. His task was not merely to command soldiers, but to hold this entire province together through a delicate balance of force and favor. Consequently, he spent as much time planning shipments of wine and fine pottery for local chieftains as he did reviewing troop deployments. The peace he was ordered to maintain was a fragile thing, bought with gifts as often as it was defended with swords. Back on the wall, Serdik's unit began its patrol. The men who marched beside him were a strange collection from across the vast empire. There was a man from Syria who complained constantly of the wet and cold, his words a curious mix of Latin and his own tongue. Another was from Gaul, a tall, quiet man who could track a deer through the thickest forest. They were all auxiliaries, non-citizens bound to the army, and their shared service created a strange, unspoken bond. Serdic found he had more in common with these foreigners than with the Roman-born legionaries in the main forts, who looked down on them all. This shared life, however, did not erase the conflict within him when they spotted movement in the heather-covered hills ahead. From his distant, comfortable study, Flavius prepared to receive one of the local Brigantian chieftains. He instructed his servants to bring out the best Italian wine and lay out a display of polished silver cups. This meeting was a performance, and every detail mattered. The chieftain would arrive in his rough woolen tunic, and Flavius would greet him in his fine toga, a clear display of Roman power and sophistication. Through this careful diplomacy, he hoped to secure the tribe's loyalty, or at least its neutrality. It was a tiring game of smiles and veiled threats, a necessary dance to prevent the province from erupting into open rebellion. Flavius often felt the immense distance from Rome, not just in miles, but in understanding. The senators in their marble halls could not grasp the subtle pressures of this wild frontier, where a delayed grain shipment could cause more trouble than a lost battle.
The movement Serdik's patrol had seen coalesced into a small band of Pictish warriors, their bodies marked with blue patterns that seemed to blend with the misty landscape. There was a tense standoff, shouts exchanged across a small stream. Serdik understood their words, the old tongue of this island, and his heart clenched. They were not screaming for blood. They were demanding the return of hunting grounds the wall had cut in two. His centurion, a grizzled Roman who had served on 3 frontiers, simply drew his sword. In the short, brutal clash that followed, Serdik fought with the disciplined efficiency he had been taught, his spear finding its mark. Yet, as he stood over the fallen warrior, he saw not an enemy, but a man who could have been his cousin. Following the diplomatic meeting, Flavius felt a familiar sense of weariness. The chieftain had accepted the gifts with a practiced politeness, but his eyes held a look the governor could never quite decipher. Was it respect, resentment, or simple calculation? To manage these people, Flavius had to think like them. Yet he was fundamentally Roman, a man who believed in law, order, and the clear lines drawn on his maps. He looked out from his villa at the green, rolling land of Britain. It was a wealthy province, a valuable part of the empire. But he sometimes wondered if it was truly Roman, or if their control was just a thin layer of stone and order spread over something much older and wilder that would one day re-emerge. The patrol returned to the fort as dusk began to fall. The men were quiet, the small victory feeling more like a grim necessity than a triumph. Serdik cleaned his spear, the motions automatic after years of drill. He ate his ration of hard bread and salted meat, the food tasteless in his mouth. In the barracks,
The Syrian auxiliary practiced his Latin with a slave, while the Gaul sharpened his knife, his face impassive. They were all caught between worlds, serving an empire that gave them pay and a purpose, but demanded they forget who they were. Cerdic wondered if his children, should he ever have them, would feel this same division, or if they would simply be Roman. That evening, Governor Flavius dictated a letter to be sent to Rome. He carefully crafted his words, emphasizing the stability of the frontier and the success of his diplomatic efforts, while subtly requesting more funds for gifts and infrastructure. The journey of that scroll would take weeks, crossing the choppy channel and traveling down the long paved roads of Gaul and Italy. The response, if it came at all, would take months. He felt this isolation acutely, a tiny outpost of Roman authority holding a very long line. The wall was their anchor, a bold declaration of the empire's edge. Cerdic climbed the ladder to the watchtower for the last guard shift of the night. The rain had finally stopped, and a few stars broke through the clouds. The land on both sides of the wall was dark and silent. He looked north, toward the unseen hills where the tribes lived by the old ways, then south toward the faint glow of the fort's fires, a small piece of Rome transplanted to this remote corner of the world. The wall stretched out in either direction, disappearing into the darkness. It was more than a barrier of stone. It was a line between what Rome controlled and what it could not, a line he was paid to defend every single day. He thought of the men he fought alongside, the governor he would never meet, and the painted warriors he was supposed to hate. They were all tied to this massive stone structure, their lives defined by its existence. The wall was a promise of security for one people, and a symbol of defiance for another. As he stood his watch, the great stone artery that cut across the island felt both like a recent angry scar upon the land and a truth as ancient and eternal as the hills themselves. Slow, Drusus woke to the familiar chill of stone against his skin. In the dim light of the gladiator school's barracks, his breath formed a faint cloud before him. He ran a hand over his body, a landscape of raised, pale lines against his weathered skin. Each scar was a chapter in the story of his survival, a clumsy strike from a Gaul in a provincial arena, a lion's claw that had grazed his shoulder, a deep cut from a practice session that went too far. He and the other men rose without a word, the only sounds being the rustle of coarse wool tunics and the quiet groan of muscles that never fully healed. The routine was their master now, a rhythm of training and waiting that had replaced the seasons of the farm he barely remembered from his homeland in Thrace. Across the city, in a villa where the floors were warmed by an ingenious system of hot air pipes, Senator Decimus began his day differently. He reclined on a couch as a servant offered him a platter of figs, sweetened with imported honey, and small cakes made with fine wheat flour. He sipped wine cooled with snow, brought down from the mountains, its sweetness a pleasant contrast to the tartness of the grapes. Through an open portico, he could see the meticulously tended garden, where the splash of a fountain provided a gentle, constant music. His thoughts were not on survival, but on logistics. The cost of the Numidian leopards for the afternoon spectacle was higher than expected, a detail he discussed with his aide. For Decimus, the games were an essential investment in the stability of Rome, and, more importantly, in his own political future. Back in the ludus, the training yard, the sharp crack of wood on wood echoed off the high walls. Drusus moved through his drills, his curved sword, the sika, a blur in his hand. His small, square shield felt like an extension of his arm. He was a slave, his life owned by the school's master, the lanista, but in the yard, he was a professional. He ate better than most of the city's free poor, a diet heavy on barley and beans that built the muscle needed to endure the arena. He was a celebrity, whose likeness was scratched onto walls and molded into clay lamps. Yet his existence depended entirely on his ability to please a crowd. He and his fellow gladiators were expensive, valuable property, trained and fed for one purpose: to provide a spectacle of life and death that kept the populace of Rome distracted and content.
This very contentment was the subject of Senator Decimus's conversation as he was carried through the streets in a covered chair, lifted on the shoulders of 8 stout servants. He spoke with a fellow senator who walked beside him, their fine wool togas a stark white against the city's grime. The grain shipments from Egypt are secure for another season, Decimus noted, gesturing toward a public granary where a long line of people already snaked around the corner. A full belly and a thrilling show in the Colosseum are better than any legion for keeping the peace. His companion nodded in agreement. The strategy was an old one, a simple formula for managing the hundreds of thousands crowded into the capital. It ensured that the people's passions were spent on cheering for a favorite gladiator, not on questioning the vast fortunes amassed by men like them. As the procession neared the Colosseum, the low hum of the city grew into a roar. Drusus stood with the others in the cavernous, cool darkness beneath the arena floor. The air was a strange mix of scents: the sharp odor of nervous sweat, the musky smell of wild animals in nearby cages, and the faint, sweet perfume drifting down from the wealthy patrons in the stands above. He could hear the sand being raked smooth on the arena floor, and the clanking of the lift that would soon hoist him into the light. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, a feeling that was not quite fear, but a cold, sharp awareness of what was to come. He was an entertainer, and the stage awaited. He exchanged a brief, understanding glance with another gladiator, a man from Britannia. They were from opposite ends of the world, yet here they shared the same precarious fate. Decimus settled into his cushioned seat in one of the shaded boxes closest to the arena. From this vantage point, he had a perfect view of the proceedings and, just as importantly, the emperor's box across the way. He acknowledged greetings from other powerful men,
his smile practiced and easy. He felt the immense power of the place, the collective energy of 50,000 people focused on the sand-covered oval below. He had sponsored these games at great personal expense, and he watched the crowd's reactions as intently as he watched the fights. Their roars of approval were votes, their excitement a measure of his success. He saw the gladiators not as individual men with pasts and fears, but as pieces in a grand, expensive game of public opinion. The gates swung open, and Drusus strode onto the hot sand. After the gloom of the waiting area, the brightness made him squint for a moment. The sound washed over him, a physical force that vibrated through the soles of his sandals. 50,000 voices, a single thunderous entity demanding blood. He raised his sword in salute to the emperor, the gesture automatic, his mind already calculating, assessing his opponent, who entered from the opposite gate. The man was a secutor, heavily armored, with a large, smooth helmet that left only 2 small eye holes. He was a walking fortress of bronze and leather, his strategy to wear Drusus down. Drusus, by contrast, was swift and lightly armored, his survival dependent on speed and precision. The fight was a blur of movement and sound. Drusus danced away from the secutor's heavy charges, the man's short sword swishing through the air where he had been moments before. The crowd roared with every near miss. Drusus used his small shield to deflect blows, the impact jarring his arm, while looking for an opening. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and the grit of the sand coated his tongue. He was not fighting for glory, nor for the palm of victory that awaited the winner. He was fighting for his next breath, for the chance to see the sunset one more time. He was fighting for the simple, brutal prize of continued existence, a commodity more valuable than all the gold in Decimus's villa. From his shaded box, Decimus watched with a critical eye. The pairing was a good one, the classic contest of agility against power. The crowd was on its feet, their indecision about whom to cheer for making the noise even louder. He noted with satisfaction that several of his political rivals looked on with envy. This was a spectacle they could not afford to match. He made a mental note to reward the lanista for providing such excellent combatants. His mind was already moving ahead, planning the distribution of free bread that would follow the games, ensuring his name would be on everyone's lips for weeks to come. The life or death struggle on the sand below was merely the centerpiece of a much larger, more important political performance. With a sudden feint and a lunge, Drusus caught the secutor off balance. His curved sword found a gap in the armor just below the man's knee. The big man stumbled, tried to recover, but fell heavily to the sand with a crash of bronze. He lay there, wounded and exhausted, and raised one finger on his left hand, the traditional appeal for mercy. The entire Colosseum fell into a sudden, strange silence. All eyes turned from the fallen gladiator to the box where Senator Decimus sat. Drusus stood over his opponent, his chest heaving, his sword ready. He, too, watched the senator, his own life now hanging on the gesture of another man, a man who did not know his name. Decimus felt the wake of 50,000 pairs of eyes upon him. He let the moment stretch, savoring the power of it.
He glanced at the crowd, gauging their mood. They were divided. Some called for mercy, others for the kill. A live gladiator was an asset that could fight again, but a dramatic death was what people would talk about for days. He considered the cost of the fallen man against the political capital of a decisive, crowd-pleasing finish. He made his decision not with a dramatic thumb gesture, but with a subtle, sharp jab of his hand, a motion almost invisible to those far away, but perfectly clear to the officials in the arena. It was a gesture that meant death.
Drusus saw the signal. He took no pleasure in it. It was simply the conclusion of his work. He dispatched his opponent quickly, cleanly, a professional ending a contest. The crowd erupted, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the immense structure. He stood alone in the center of the arena for a moment, the victor, the survivor. He was given a palm branch and a small purse heavy with coins before he walked back toward the darkness of the tunnel, leaving the roaring crowd behind. The applause was for the spectacle he had provided, not for the man who had endured it. In the fading light of the city, Decimus accepted the congratulations of his peers, his investment having paid off handsomely in prestige and public favor. He would host a lavish dinner that evening, where the day's events would be recounted with relish. Elsewhere, in the quiet of the barracks, Drusus handed most of his prize money to the lanista, as was required. He kept a few coins for himself. As the oil lamps were lit, casting long shadows on the stone walls, he cleaned his equipment and tended to a new gash on his forearm. In the growing quiet, Drusus carried the day's brutal victory into an uneasy, shallow rest. In her shop in Ephesus, Lydia turned a denarius over in her palm. The coin, meant to be silver, felt unnervingly light, and where the emperor's profile was worn smooth, a dull bronze color showed through like a sickness beneath the skin. It was not the first coin of its kind she had received that day. She could remember a time, not so long ago, when the money felt solid and real, each piece carrying a satisfying weight that promised value. Now they felt like hollow shells, a lie she was forced to accept and pass on to others. This erosion of trust was a slow poison, making every transaction a potential argument and every customer a potential accuser. She sighed, her breath stirring the dust on a stack of unsold amphorae, the large clay jars used for storing wine and oil.
The consequences of this flimsy money rippled through every part of her day. A loaf of bread that had cost a single coin just a few years before now demanded 10, and the price seemed to shift with every rumor that drifted in from the port. Customers, their faces pinched with worry, would argue fiercely over the cost of a handful of olives or a measure of grain, their tempers worn thin by the constant uncertainty. Lydia found herself spending more time defending her prices than selling her goods. The easy familiarity that once existed between neighbors had been replaced by a quiet suspicion. Everyone felt cheated, and they looked for someone to blame, often settling on the person standing right in front of them, the shopkeeper. This growing difficulty was magnified by the silence from the harbor. Trade caravans that once arrived with predictable regularity now came in fits and starts, or not at all. The merchants who did make the journey told stories that made Lydia's stomach tighten. Tales of roving armies that were indistinguishable from bandits, and roads where the only law was the sword. Because of this, the flow of goods from the interior had slowed to a trickle. Exotic spices from the east were becoming a distant memory, and even reliable staples like Italian wine were growing scarce. Her shelves held more empty space than pottery, a constant, dusty reminder of a world that felt like it was shrinking and breaking apart. Far away on the Danube frontier, the source of that chaos was being forged in the cold, damp air. Valerius, a soldier in the legions, stood with his comrades, his breath misting in front of him. They were part of a vast machine of defense, but the machine was now devouring itself. Minutes ago, they had lifted their general onto a massive shield, the metal groaning under his weight. Their rhythmic shouts of Imperator, meaning commander, but now a title for an emperor, echoed off the gray forested hills. The man they hailed was the third to claim the title in 5 years, and the last emperor, killed in a battle against a Gothic tribe, had ruled for less than 2 years. Authority no longer flowed from the distant city of Rome. It was seized by any commander with enough loyal swords to enforce his claim. The ritual was one of raw power. Men banged their swords against the rims of their shields, creating a harsh mix of sounds that was more intimidating than any trumpet call. For Valerius, the moment was filled with a dizzying energy. The old system of senators and distant rulers meant nothing here on the empire's edge. Here, a man's worth was measured by his ability to lead in battle and, more importantly, his willingness to reward his soldiers. Loyalty was not given to an abstract idea of the empire. It was given to the man who promised a donative, a bonus of gold and silver that could secure a future for a soldier who might not live to see the next season. This promise of reward was the engine driving the constant upheaval. Valerius and the men around him knew their general would have to find the coin to pay them, and that meant marching on a rival, sacking a wealthy city, or seizing a provincial treasury. They were no longer simply defending the border from outside threats. Instead, they were fighting other Roman legions who had made the same calculation and declared their own general emperor. The lines on the map had become blurred, with Roman soldiers now viewing other Roman soldiers as their primary enemy and the source of potential plunder. It was a war fought for paychecks, not for principle. Amid the cheering, Valerius felt a surge of power, but it was tangled with a deep and growing unease. He had taken an oath when he joined the army, a solemn vow to protect the Senate and people of Rome, to defend the empire from all enemies. Yet here he was, pledging his life to one man in a bid to seize control, an act that would surely lead to more fighting against men who wore the same eagle standard on their shields. He was a Roman soldier, trained to be a bastion of order, now actively participating in the very chaos that was pulling everything apart. The empire he had sworn to protect felt like a distant memory, replaced by a brutal struggle for survival and spoil. That struggle was felt in every corner of the Roman world. Back in Ephesus, Lydia heard a traveler whisper that yet another emperor had been proclaimed on the frontier, the news arriving like a tremor before an earthquake. It meant little to her who wore the purple robes in some faraway palace. What it meant in her shop was that the coins would likely become even worse as the new ruler scrambled to pay his armies. It meant the roads would become more dangerous and the ships would remain in their ports. Her world was not one of armies and thrones, but of ledgers and scales, and she could feel the foundations of that world crumbling with each worthless coin that passed through her hands. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the marble streets of Ephesus, Lydia counted the day's earnings. The small pile of bronze and silver-washed coins seemed to mock her for her efforts. It was barely enough to buy flour for her family's evening meal. She looked around her quiet, half-empty shop, a place that had been in her family for 3 generations, and wondered how much longer they could hold on. The great, sprawling empire, with its paved roads and grand temples, had always felt eternal, as solid as the very stone beneath her feet. Now she was no longer so sure. The unease she felt was a quiet echo of the conflict tearing at Valerius. He sat by a flickering campfire, the light catching the worn leather of his sandals, and sharpened his sword with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on metal was a familiar, comforting sound in a world that had lost its sense. He was not thinking of Rome or of glory, but of the next battle, the next march, and the promised coins that might one day buy him a small plot of land. The empire was a grand story told by old men, but his life was about the man next to him and the general who fed him. He had chosen his side because there was no other real choice to be made. Lydia closed the heavy wooden door to her shop, the sound of the bolts sliding home offering a small, temporary feeling of security. Tomorrow would bring its own anxieties and its own frayed tempers.
Alaric felt the familiar weight of his Roman cavalry helmet, its polished iron cool against his brow, as he guided his horse to the head of the column. Below him, the valley unfolded in a patchwork of damp greens and browns, a landscape that tugged at a memory of his homeland. His warriors, a formidable unit of Gothic horsemen, moved with a fluid grace that the legionaries could never quite master. They were allies of the empire, sworn to its defense in exchange for grain and a place to call their own, a status the Romans called foederati. This arrangement, a formal treaty of federation, was meant to make them part of the Roman world. Yet Alaric could always feel the invisible line between his people and the men who commanded them. His men spoke their own tongue in low voices, the sound a comforting rumble against the jingle of Roman-made harnesses. This division was never clearer than in the commander's tent, where the air was warm with the scent of spiced wine and burning oil lamps. Alaric stood before a detailed map of the Danube frontier, pointing to a crossing his scouts had found. "They will not use the main ford," he explained in practiced formal Latin. "My kinsmen value surprise over a direct assault.
they will cross here, through the marshes. The Roman general, a portly man named Valens, whose armor seemed a size too small, exchanged a look with his staff. He tapped the map on the main road with a dismissive finger. Roman legions do not chase ghosts through swamps, chieftain. We will hold the bridge. That is how battles are won. Alaric felt a familiar tightening in his jaw, but he simply bowed his head in acceptance. His knowledge, born from a lifetime of understanding his own people, was treated as the charming folklore of a provincial, not the hard-won intelligence of a warrior. The consequences of this arrogance were laid bare a week later. As Valens had predicted, a small force did indeed attack the bridge, a noisy but ultimately feeble distraction. The main war party, just as Alaric had warned, crossed through the marshes and fell upon the legion's supply train. It was Alaric and his Gothic cavalry who were sent to drive them off, a chaotic and brutal fight in the mud. They succeeded, but not without cost. As he walked through the makeshift infirmary later, the smell of blood and boiled linen sharp in his nostrils, he saw the faces of his men. Too many were wounded, and 3 would not see the sunrise. Valens offered him a brisk commendation for his unit's barbaric fury, a compliment that felt more like an insult. He was beginning to wonder if Rome saw his men as a shield to be shattered, a tool to be used and discarded once its edge was dull. As autumn bled into a bitter winter, a new and more dangerous enemy appeared: hunger. The promised shipments of grain from the Roman quartermasters did not arrive. At first, the excuses were plausible: early snows, impassable roads. But as the weeks dragged on, the truth became harder to ignore. In the sprawling camp where his people lived, the laughter of children grew quiet. He saw his own wife, her face thin and pale, carefully rationing what little flour they had left. The vibrant life of his tribe was being replaced by a listless, gnawing emptiness. The cold bit deeper each day, forcing families to huddle together for warmth, their cloaks pulled tight around them as the wind found every crack in their simple wooden huts. Alaric finally sought out the chief supply officer, a man named Licinius, whose office was comfortably warm and who wore a fine wool tunic unstained by mud or work. "My people were promised grain as part of our treaty," Alaric stated, keeping his voice even. Licinius did not rise from his seat, instead making a show of studying a scroll on his desk. "The Empire has many mouths to feed, chieftain," he said with a sigh, as if burdened by immense responsibilities. "Your request has been noted. You must be patient." Through the open doorway, Alaric could see sacks of grain stacked high in a guarded storehouse, reserved for the legions. The sight of that abundance, set against his hungry children, was a betrayal sharper than any sword. Patience, he realized, was simply a word the powerful used to silence the desperate. Walking back to his family's quarters, the cold felt more personal, a physical manifestation of Roman indifference. The smell of wood smoke from the campfires was thin, a sign that fuel was being conserved as carefully as food. He passed a group of elders, their faces grim, their conversation ceasing the moment they saw him approach. They did not need to speak. Their eyes held the question he could not answer. Inside his dwelling, his youngest son was asleep, his breathing shallow. His daughter looked up at him, her expression not accusatory, but filled with a simple, heartbreaking trust that he, her father and her chief, would provide. It was a trust he was failing to honor, and the shame of it was a heavy stone in his gut. That night, Alaric sat by the low fire, the bronze eagle on the pommel of his Roman sword glinting in the flickering light. For years, he had admired the empire's sense of order, its great roads and unyielding laws. He had believed that by serving it, he could secure a future for his people, a permanent place within that grand structure. But he saw now that they were not meant to be stones in the foundation. They were merely props holding up a wall, to be removed when they were no longer needed. The oath he had sworn to a distant, faceless emperor felt hollow when weighed against the hungry faces of his own tribe. The bond was not one of mutual respect, but of master and servant, and the master had failed to uphold his end of the bargain. He sent messengers, not to the Roman command, but to the other Gothic chieftains in his unit. They gathered in the great longhouse, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and worried men. Here, away from Roman ears, he spoke in the rolling cadences of their own language. He told them of the meeting with Licinius, of the grain held in the storehouses, and of the silence from the general. He did not need to speak of the hunger. They all felt it in their own homes. As he spoke, he saw the simmering resentment in their eyes ignite into a cold, hard anger. These were warriors, not beggars. Their loyalty, once given freely to the empire, was now returning to its true source, their own survival, their own people. A decision was made, not in a thunder of shouts, but in a series of quiet, determined nods. The respect they held for Rome had been a fragile thing, built on promises. With those promises broken, it shattered completely. The next morning, Alaric stood on a small rise overlooking the camp. He watched his men, not drilling in Roman formations, but checking the straps on their saddles and sharpening their long, straight-bladed ancestral swords. They were no longer a unit of the Roman army. They were a Gothic tribe, united and readying themselves for a journey. Their gaze was no longer fixed on the northern frontier they were meant to defend. It was turned south toward the rich, warm, and well-fed heart of the very empire that had betrayed them. Around the bustling, purposeful camp, the familiar sounds of a people on the move replaced the quiet despair of the winter. The ring of a blacksmith's hammer on steel, the murmur of commands in their native tongue, and the lowing of oxen being yoked to carts created a new, resolute rhythm. In his office in the city of Nicomedia, Julian carefully broke the wax seal on the scroll delivered by an imperial courier. The stiff papyrus crackled as he unrolled it, the sound sharp in the quiet room. A strong, dark scent of fresh ink rose from the document, a smell he had come to associate with yet another command from on high. His fingers traced the precise lettering of the title, Edictum de Praetis Rerum Venalium, an edict on maximum prices. Julian began to read, his eyes moving across columns of items and their newly fixed costs. A measure of wheat, a pair of leather sandals, the daily wage for a laborer, the price of a pound of pork. Every imaginable good and service was listed, its value now set by the will of the emperors. This was another piece of the new order, a rigid framework intended to stop the endless decay that had plagued the empire for a generation. It was meant to bring stability after a century of chaos. His own position was a perfect example of this new, unbending world. As a decurion, a member of the town council, his family had once held a place of honor. They had willingly spent their own fortunes on public buildings and festivals. But now that honor had become a hereditary chain. He was personally responsible for collecting the town's taxes, a sum dictated by distant administrators who cared little for failed harvests or struggling merchants. If the collection fell short, his own property would be seized to cover the difference. He had seen 2 of his neighbors ruined this way, their ancestral lands sold off to satisfy the state's insatiable hunger. This new stability felt less like a restoration and more like a finely crafted cage, one whose bars were forged from imperial decrees, just like the one lying on his desk. This edict, like all the others, came not from one emperor, but from 4. Julian thought of the system they called the tetrarchy, a rule of 4 men designed to make the vast empire manageable. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior ones, the Caesars. Each governed a quarter of the world. It was a clever solution to the problem of civil war and succession that had nearly torn everything apart. No longer did a single man's death threaten to plunge the world into darkness. Yet this division of power had also created a sense of distance. The emperors were no longer men one might see in the forum. They were remote figures, almost divine, whose will was expressed through an endless stream of scrolls and a growing army of officials. Julian felt more like a functionary than a citizen, a gear in a machine so vast he could not comprehend its full design. He sighed, rolled the scroll back up, and tied it with a leather cord. "Have this posted in the marketplace," he told his clerk, his voice flat. "Ensure a crier reads it aloud, so that no one can claim ignorance." As the clerk left, Julian walked to the window overlooking the city. Below, he could see the results of the new order everywhere. The streets were clean and patrolled. The city walls, crumbling for decades, had been repaired with disciplined efficiency. Trade, though now strictly regulated, moved along secure roads. The chaos his father had described, of usurper emperors rising and falling within months, of worthless coins and runaway prices, was gone. But in its place was a heavy, enforced quiet, an order built on compulsion, not on consent. Out in that same marketplace, the stonemason Stephanus wiped a film of white dust from his hands onto his tunic. The fine grit was a permanent part of him, embedded in the lines of his palms and under his fingernails. He was choosing a block of marble for a new commission, running his calloused fingers over the cool, smooth stone to feel for imperfections. Nearby, a crowd was gathering around the public notice board where a crier was shouting the words of the new edict. Stephanus drifted closer, listening with mild interest as the crier listed the price of wine and oil. Then he heard a part that made him freeze. The crier's voice boomed, declaring that every man was now bound to his father's trade.
A baker's son must become a baker, a sailor's son a sailor, and a stonemason's son a stonemason. A cold weight settled in Stephanus's stomach. He thought of his young son, barely 10 years old, a boy who loved books and dreamed of becoming a scribe. That dream was now dead, extinguished by a line of ink on a scroll. His craft, a source of deep pride, passed down through 3 generations, had instantly transformed into an inescapable sentence for his entire bloodline. He was no longer just a skilled artisan, he was a servant of the state. His skills and his children's futures now the property of the empire. He was bound to his profession as surely as a slave was bound to his master. The marketplace, usually a place of lively chatter and argument, felt strangely subdued. People listened, their faces grim, and then dispersed without a word. The news a shared burden, too heavy to discuss. Stephanus looked across the square at the new monument he had recently helped complete. It was a tall column topped with statues of the 4 emperors. He had carved one of them himself. The instructions had been specific. All 4 figures were to look identical. Their faces were stern, impersonal, and interchangeable. Their bodies rigid in military armor. There was no hint of individual character, only a representation of unified, absolute power. At the time, he had thought it a strange artistic choice, a departure from the lifelike portraits of the past. Now he understood. The empire no longer celebrated individuals, it demanded uniformity. Each person had a role, a price, a place from which they could not move. He and his son were now like those statues, not men, but symbols of a fixed and permanent state.
Later that day, Julian walked home through the city as the afternoon light softened. He saw Stephanus, the stonemason, guiding a cart with a new block of marble, his movements powerful but lacking their usual energy. He saw merchants in their stalls counting out the newly regulated prices with resigned expressions. The sense of order was undeniable. There were no beggars harassing passers-by, no buildings falling into ruin. The empire was secure, its borders defended by disciplined legions, and its economy stabilized by imperial command. This was the peace Diocletian had forged, a peace born of iron will. It was, Julian had to admit, better than the bloody anarchy that had come before. Yet a question lingered in his mind, one he dared not speak aloud. He saw the faces of the people, the lack of spontaneity in their interactions, the careful way they spoke. They were fed and they were safe, but something essential had been lost. The vibrant, sometimes chaotic spirit of the old republic, the one he read about in scrolls of history, seemed a world away. That world had been full of dangerous freedoms, of fierce debates in the forum, and fortunes won and lost on daring ventures. This new world was predictable, orderly, and suffocating. He wondered if his children would even understand the concept of choosing their own path in life. Had they saved the body of the empire only to lose its soul? Stephanus returned to his workshop as evening fell. He lit an oil lamp, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows across the stone figures that lined the walls. He picked up his hammer and chisel.
the familiar weight of the tools in his hands a comfort he had always cherished. Tonight, they just felt heavy. He looked at the half-finished bust of a wealthy merchant, the stone waiting for him to bring it to life. He remembered the joy he had once felt in the act of creation, of seeing a face emerge from a shapeless block. Now, all he felt was the unending obligation to perform his assigned task, today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come. He lifted the hammer, the motion stiff and automatic. The sharp ring of metal striking metal echoed in the small space, a lonely and repetitive sound. His son would one day stand in this same spot, holding these same tools, making this same sound. The thought brought him no comfort, no sense of legacy. It brought only a profound sadness for a choice his son would never get to make. The empire was stable, but it was a stability built on the bones of 1,000,000 dead dreams. He set the tools down, the silence that followed feeling louder than the noise had been. Julian, from his own home, could hear the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a sound that would be the same tomorrow and the day after. The city was quiet, orderly, and secure under the watchful eyes of the 4 emperors. He looked at a portrait of his own father, a man who had complained about taxes, but had always believed he was a master of his own fate. Julian was no longer sure he could say the same. He was a pillar of the community, but he was also a prisoner of his duty, just like everyone else. He was a guardian of a peace that cost more than anyone wanted to admit. The empire had been pulled back from the brink of collapse. It had been given a new foundation of stone and mortar, one of rules and regulations that held everything together with immense force. But as Julian sat in the growing darkness, he could not shake the feeling that this new foundation was also a tombstone. It marked the end of an era, burying the chaotic, vibrant, and free Rome he had only ever known from stories. The empire would survive, but its people, he feared, would simply endure. The faint, metallic tang of the ink from the edict seemed to linger in the air as Julian contemplated the rigid peace that now governed all their lives.
Flavia, the eldest of the priestesses, felt the familiar coolness of the marble floor through the thin soles of her sandals. Her movements were a ritual perfected over 60 years, a slow and deliberate dance within the sacred walls of the Temple of Vesta. She trimmed the wick of the central lamp, her hands steady despite their age, adding the clear, fragrant oil that was the temple's lifeblood. For 1,000 years, the flame had burned, a symbol of Rome's enduring heart, and her life, like her mother's and grandmother's before her, was dedicated to ensuring it never went out. Yet the silence in the great round temple was different now. It was no longer a reverent hush filled with the quiet footsteps of petitioners, but an empty, echoing quiet that seemed to absorb the light of the flame itself. She could go a whole day without a single prominent family sending a daughter to learn the old ways, or a senator leaving a small offering for the city's continued prosperity. This profound stillness allowed her to recall the past with a sharp clarity. She remembered the festivals of her youth, when the area around the temple would be so crowded with people that moving through it felt like wading through a river. The scent of roasting meat from public feasts and the sound of hymns to Jupiter and Juno would drift through the forum. Now, the great festivals felt like performances for their own sake, attended mostly by old families who did so out of habit rather than true belief. The city's pulse was growing faint, or perhaps it was just beating in a different place now, a place she could not and would not enter. The gods seemed to be waiting, but fewer and fewer people seemed to be listening for their response, their attention drawn elsewhere.
Her thoughts were interrupted by the entrance of a younger priestess, Livia, whose service had begun only 5 years prior. The girl performed her duties with a mechanical precision that lacked the deep, ingrained reverence Flavia felt in her own bones. "The magistrate sent word," Livia said, her voice too loud in the hallowed space. "The imperial contribution for the sacred oil will be reduced again next month. He says the funds are needed for the construction of a new basilica near the Lateran Palace." Flavia simply nodded, her lips tightening. A basilica. Another grand hall for the followers of the Nazarene carpenter. It was happening not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet scratching of a stylus on a ledger, diverting the flow of gold away from the gods of Rome and towards this new, singular god from the east. She wondered if Livia even understood the meaning of the change, or if it was just another administrative task to her. Later, standing at the temple's entrance, Flavia looked out over the forum. The old heart of the Republic was still grand, but it felt like a museum. In the distance, beyond the familiar rooftops and columns, she could see the wooden skeletons of new buildings rising. These were not temples to Mars or Apollo with their open porticos and familiar statues. They were different, their shapes tall and long, built to hold hundreds of people inside, all facing one direction. Emperor Constantine, the man who claimed to have seen a sign in the heavens, was not just tolerating the new faith. He was building it a new home, stone by stone, right in the center of their world. For Flavia, these structures were not just buildings, they were monuments to a future that had no place for her, or for the flame she guarded. In a far different part of the city, in a cramped room behind a bustling bakery, Marius felt a nervous energy that was the opposite of the forum's cold grandeur. The air was warm and smelled of yeast and wood smoke, a comforting human scent. He stood with 24 others, a legionary with a scarred face, a laundress whose hands were raw from her work, a merchant who traded in Egyptian glass. Here, their stations in the world outside seemed to melt away. They were simply people, gathered in a space where the promise of a different kind of life was shared in hushed tones. He watched as a man named Paulus spoke, not with the booming oratory of a senator, but with a simple, earnest voice about love, forgiveness, and a kingdom not of this world. There were no grand statues or marble altars here, only a wooden table with bread and a cup of wine. The moment came for his own initiation. Marius stepped forward
and knelt as Paulus poured cool water over his head. The droplets ran down his face, and with them came a feeling not of magic or divine thunder, but of profound peace, a washing away of an old self. In the world of the old gods, one made sacrifices and hoped for favor in return. A good harvest, safety in battle, a healthy child. It was a transaction. But here, he was told he was loved regardless of his offerings, that his worth was not measured in coins or status. This idea was so revolutionary, so powerful, it felt like the firmest ground he had ever stood upon. He was no longer just Marius, a stonemason's son with few prospects, but a brother in a vast and growing family. After the ceremony, they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and olives. The legionary, Cassius, spoke of his service on the Danube frontier. He told a story not of battle, but of how the Christian bishop in a local town had organized a collection to feed the families of soldiers, Roman and auxiliary alike, when their grain shipments were late. The governor just sent excuses, Cassius grumbled, tearing a piece of bread. But they shared what little they had. It's why I started listening. Marius heard stories like this all the time. The new faith was spreading not just through sermons, but through small, tireless acts of kindness, building a community from the ground up, while the old state religion seemed to be crumbling from the top down.
Walking home through the twisting streets, as twilight settled over the city, Marius felt a quiet confidence. He knew there was still danger. Many older, powerful Romans viewed his faith with deep suspicion, seeing it as a strange foreign cult that preached disobedience to the state gods and, by extension, to Rome itself. Some of his neighbors muttered that Christians were the cause of every flood and plague, a punishment for their abandonment of the old ways. He passed a patrol of the city watch, and for a fleeting moment, his heart quickened. But then he saw the symbol one of the soldiers had scratched onto the leather of his shield. The intertwined Greek letters Chi and Rho, the sign of Christ that the emperor himself now used. The sight settled his nerves. He was part of something that was no longer just hiding in back rooms. Back in the temple of Vesta, the last of the evening light faded, leaving the sacred flame as the only source of warmth and illumination. Flavia completed her final duties for the night, ensuring the stores of oil were secure and the temple doors were barred. The oil they received now was of a lesser grade than what the imperial court had once supplied. It burned with a faint smokiness, and the flame sometimes seemed to sputter, as if it were struggling to breathe the very air of this new Rome. Each flicker sent a wave of anxiety through her. She was not just a guardian of a fire. She was the keeper of a promise made at the city's birth. She sat on a low stone bench, her gaze fixed on the dancing light. The flame represented continuity, the unbroken line connecting the children of the present to the founders of the past. It was Rome's soul, eternal and unchanging. But what if it wasn't? What if a soul could change, could decide to inhabit a new body, leaving the old one to grow cold? The question was a deep and frightening one, and she felt a profound loneliness. The other priestesses were young. they would find a way to live in the world that was coming. But her world was this temple and this flame.
In the deep stillness of the sanctum, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten prayers and the weight of 1,000 years, Flavia could almost forget the slow, relentless turning of a world that no longer looked to her gods for light. She watched the steady burn, a small point of unwavering heat against the encroaching cold, and for a moment that was enough. From his villa high on the Aventine Hill, Senator Gaius Appius first heard the sound not as a threat, but as a violation. It was the harsh ring of iron on stone, a sound that belonged on a distant frontier, not in the heart of the world. For 800 years, no enemy's footstep had echoed on these paved streets. He stood motionless in his garden, the familiar scent of jasmine and cypress suddenly failing to soothe the tightening in his chest. Below him, the sprawling city, a universe of marble and brick, seemed to hold its breath. Then came the shouting, a coarse, guttural sound in a language he did not know, followed by the splintering of a heavy door somewhere down the slope. The sounds were wrong, an impossible intrusion into the ordered rhythm of Roman life, and with them came a chilling understanding. The walls had been breached. Across the city, in a crowded apartment building near the markets, the noise sent a different kind of shock through Licinia's small world. Her father, a baker whose hands were always dusted with flour, threw open the shutters and peered into the torchlight chaos of the street below. He pulled his head back in, his face pale, and his next actions were swift and silent. He barred the door, gathered his family, and wrapped 2 loaves of yesterday's bread in a cloth. There was no time for questions. Licinia's mother grabbed a waterskin while her father pulled her and her brother close, whispering that they must go to the church, to the cellar beneath the altar where the priests kept the old relics. They moved through the narrow alleyways, shadows clinging to the walls, the sounds of violence growing louder with every step. All Licinia could think of was the small wooden doll she had left behind on her sleeping mat.
They found shelter in the damp, stone-lined basement of the basilica, huddled with 24 other families who had the same idea. The air grew close, each breath a shared portion of fear and uncertainty. Above them, the city was a symphony of destruction. Licinia pressed her face into her mother's cloak, trying to block out the muffled crashes, the distant screams, and the triumphant roars of the invaders. A single oil lamp cast long, flickering shadows on the stone walls, making the faces of the strangers around them look like frightened masks. An old man murmured prayers to saints Licinia had never heard of, his voice a low, trembling counterpoint to the chaos overhead. Her father sat with his back to the heavy wooden door they had bolted from within, a simple iron bar his only weapon, his body a silent promise of protection that felt impossibly fragile. Meanwhile, Gaius Appius had not moved from his home. He had dismissed his few remaining servants, telling them to save themselves. But he could not bring himself to abandon the house of his ancestors. He walked through the atrium, his hand trailing over the cool, smooth marble of his grandfather's bust.
This man had served as consul. His great-grandfather had fought alongside Trajan. Their faces, carved in stone, represented an unbroken line of service, a belief in an order that was meant to be eternal. From a high window, he could see smoke beginning to rise from the direction of the Forum, the civic and spiritual heart of the empire. The sight did not bring tears. It brought a profound emptiness, a cold certainty that this was not a battle, but an undoing. The Visigoths were not just looting buildings. They were tearing down an idea that had stood for a millennium.
For 3 days, the city became a prison of sound and shadow. In the church cellar, Licinia's world shrank to the circle of lamplight, the taste of stale water, and the comforting weight of her brother sleeping against her shoulder. The initial terror subsided into a dull, gnawing anxiety. People shared their meager scraps of food, their whispered stories of what they saw in the streets, becoming the only news of the world outside. One merchant spoke of the Salarian Gate being opened from the inside, a story of betrayal that seemed to wound the listeners more than the tales of violence. It was easier to understand an enemy at the gates than a failure from within. Survival became the only creed, and the once vibrant community of the city was reduced to small, isolated pockets of humanity hiding in darkness, waiting for the storm to pass. Gaius Appius spent those same 3 days in his library, surrounded by scrolls that held the wisdom of poets, historians, and philosophers. He did not read. The words of Cicero on the Republic and Virgil on the destiny of Rome felt like cruel jokes. He listened as the sounds of looting drew nearer. Eventually, they came for his villa. He heard his own doors splinter, the crash of pottery, the heavy, booted footsteps of men who walked as if they owned the world. He hid in a small, windowless room used for storing olive oil, the earthy smell of the jars a strange comfort in the midst of the destruction. He heard them smashing the statues in the atrium, their laughter echoing through the halls where generations of his family had debated law and politics. They were not just taking gold and silver, they were erasing a history they did not understand, and he felt a sorrow so deep it was almost silent. When the noise finally subsided on the 4th morning, a new, unsettling quiet descended upon the city. It was not the familiar morning quiet of a waking populace, but the exhausted silence of a place that had suffered a mortal blow. From the cellar, Licinia's father unbarred the door and peered out. Hesitantly, the families emerged one by one, blinking as their eyes adjusted to the gray light filtering through the smoke-filled sky. The world they stepped into was a landscape of ruin. Buildings they had passed every day were now charred skeletons. Temple doors hung from their hinges, their sacred inner chambers exposed and empty. Statues of emperors and gods lay toppled in the streets, their marble faces staring blankly at the sky like forgotten ancestors. The sense of eternal order, the simple belief that Rome was Rome and would always be, had vanished. Licinia clutched her mother's hand as they walked through the debris-strewn streets toward their home. She saw things a child should never see: the broken remnants of a merchant's stall, its vibrant fabrics trampled in the mud, a chariot overturned and stripped of its bronze fittings, the stunned, hollow-eyed faces of other survivors picking through the wreckage of their lives. When they reached their apartment block, they found the door smashed open and the inside ransacked. Everything of value was gone. Yet her father's first action was not to despair, but to check the hearth, his baker's instincts overriding everything else. He looked at the cold ashes, and then at his family, and for the first time, Licinia saw a flicker of the old resolve in his eyes. They still had their lives. They would start again. Gaius Appius also emerged from his hiding place, stepping into the ruin of his own home. The library scrolls were scattered and torn, used as kindling for a small fire the looters had made in the center of the mosaic floor. The busts of his ancestors were gone, either stolen for their fine materials or simply smashed for sport. He walked out into his garden. The jasmine was trampled, but a few cypress trees still stood tall against the smoky skyline. He looked down upon Rome. The great monuments, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts, were still standing, bruised but not broken. The city was wounded, grievously so, but it was not dead. Yet he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the Western Empire would not recover from this.
The invaders, led by their chieftain Alaric, were already gone, moving south with wagons full of plunder. They had not come to conquer and rule, but simply to take what they believed they were owed. Their departure left a vacuum, not of power, but of confidence. The city's inhabitants, from the wealthiest senators to the poorest artisans, were forced to confront a new reality. The legions that had once secured the world could no longer even secure the capital. The roads that carried commerce and culture could also carry armies of invaders. The security that had been the bedrock of their civilization was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding uncertainty about the future. For Licinia, the future was immediate and simple. It was about finding food for the day, helping her father clear the debris from his shop, and learning to live in a city where the shadows felt longer and the nights less safe. She no longer looked at the grand temples with a sense of awe, but with a new awareness of their fragility. Her world had been broken and now had to be rebuilt, piece by painful piece, without the comforting illusion that it could never be broken again. The memory of the doll she had lost became a small private symbol of all that had been taken from her and from everyone else. Gaius Appius stood on his hill and watched the survivors begin the slow, arduous task of clearing the streets. He saw neighbors helping neighbors, sharing what little they had left. A different kind of community was forming in the ashes of the old one, forged not by civic pride and imperial glory, but by a shared catastrophe and the simple necessity of continuing to live. He thought of the stories of the city's founding, of brothers raised by a wolf, a tale of hardship and brutal survival. Perhaps, he mused,
Rome was not ending, but merely returning to its fierce and difficult beginnings, stripped of its gilded certainties. He knew that the empire in the West was now just a collection of provinces, each increasingly left to fend for itself. The idea of a single, unified state governed from this one city was fading into memory. The faint echo of legionary footsteps on stone roads would grow fainter with each passing year, a sound from a world that no longer existed. The belief in an eternal city, protected by gods and destiny, had been woven so completely into their world that its unraveling left them all feeling exposed and utterly alone. And so, our journey through 500 years of Roman history concludes for the evening. Every great story, like every long day, finds its eventual peaceful close. The immense arc of this empire, from its first fervent construction to its final quiet breath, reminds us that all endeavors eventually seek rest. The voices from the Forum have long since fallen silent, and the last chariot wheel has ceased its turning. Just as that great civilization settled into the pages of history, allow your own day to settle into memory. Let the grand narrative of legions and emperors soften into a gentle murmur in the back of your mind. Your chapter for today is written. Now is the time for stillness. May you find a restorative peace in the quiet that follows, and drift into untroubled sleep. Rest well.